fires, hurricanes, earthquakes, nuclear weapons, politics. We have a lot to be thankful for. I'm not kidding. We have a lot to be thankful for. I'm not minimizing the impact of these events or issues on those who have been victimized in our country, our world, or even those closer to us. But we still have a lot to be thankful for. Over the years, I've frequently been assigned this Sunday before Thanksgiving to prepare a service, and it is one of my favorites. It's the one day that I can put in the traditional hymns that just don't have the same effect any other time of the year, even if we do gather together in joyful thanksgiving instead of to ask the Lord's blessing. Still works for me as tradition. And Thanksgiving is a holiday fraught with tradition. It might be that green bean casserole that, by the way, didn't come into fashion until the 1950s. Yet Campbell's Soup estimates that 40% of their cream of mushroom soup sales occur for Thanksgiving because it gives that casserole its lovely gray-green color. And of course, we all sit down to a table of smiling relatives as the elderly grandmotherly figure heaves onto the table the gigantic golden brown turkey, untouched by electric knife. Norman Rockwell couldn't have been wrong. And who of us of a certain age don't remember the gentle, amiable gathering of those pilgrims, replete with white collars and black high hats and shoes adorned with golden buckles? In paintings created well after the event, the pilgrims, who by the way did not call themselves pilgrims, are piously offering prayer. The Native Americans, aka Indians or savages, are often in the background, off to the side, or in several paintings they are kneeling, accepting food from some benevolent pilgrim mother. But by now, even those of us who cut out construction paper feathers and glued them to a headband in elementary school, or traced our hand to create a turkey, have been disabused of this idyllic version of the first Thanksgiving. And yet, as comforting and nostalgic as that version may have been, I'm actually more inspired to give thanks when I read about the less sanitized version, which is still, in some of its details, debated by historians. But certain details seem to be well documented. First, this was probably not the first Thanksgiving or harvest feast. Virginia, Florida, and Texas cite other fall celebrations that could qualify. It probably occurred earlier than late November, and the group of separatists that left England to escape religious persecution so they could practice it on unsuspecting others probably didn't pack their starch and ironing boards to crisp up those pristine white collars. And while they did wear the black conical hats that are part of every Walmart pilgrim costume, buckles didn't exist for several decades after the event. But this is just Thanksgiving trivia. By the way, I have a list of 50 nifty other facts to stun and entertain your relatives when conversation fails or threatens to turn into a Thanksgiving massacre. See me after the service. But what intrigues me most is the retelling of the dramatic, if less consoling, story surrounding this early feast. No matter what version you were told, you probably heard something about Squanto. Turns out his full name was Tisquantum, and if it hadn't been for him, there may not have been a feast or any survivors. As it was, half of the 102 passengers who sailed on the Mayflower died that first winter. According to some estimates, they dug 3 times more graves than they built huts. After a watchful winter with little interaction, the Native American Wampanoag tribe made contact with the Pilgrims. This is when Tisquantum was introduced to them as someone who could speak fluent English and would teach them how to till the land, cultivate crops, and live in harmony in their harsh and alien environment. Now, this seems remarkable enough to me. We are spending time this year focusing on what it means to be a welcoming congregation, welcoming all people. If we want an exemplar of what it means to be welcoming, Tisquantum should be our poster boy. First, he was accustomed to trading goods with white people when he was younger, so he had no fear in boarding Thomas Hunt's ship to barter goods, well before the Pilgrims ever arrived. But Hunt tricked Tisquantum and his friends, kidnapped them, sailed back to Europe, and sold them into slavery to Spanish monks who wanted to convert them to Christianity. But Tisquantum escaped to England, learned the English language, and returned to his homeland through a job as a translator on a merchant ship to North America. But there was no warm welcome for him. He found his entire tribe and family had been killed by illnesses brought to his land by European travelers. Only 3,000 of the 12,000 people who had lived on that land survived. And yet he took pity on these poor, clueless, unprepared white people who faced sure extinction if he did not intercede. Instead, the settlers, thanks to Tisquantum, had a wonderful summer and a bountiful harvest so that they could throw a festival. According to one of only two contemporary accounts of the 1621 Thanksgiving by Edward Winslow, they had an abundant harvest and were able to provide enough fowl, though probably not a turducken, they didn't have the Food Channel then, to, in his words, serve the company almost a week. There is disagreement whether the Wampanoags were invited or whether they showed up because the Pilgrims were, as Winslow recounts, exercising their arms. And this doesn't mean they were doing bench presses. These guys were shooting off their guns, and the Native Americans came to see if the settlers were under attack. Whatever the reason, the tribal people were welcomed and contributed 5 deer, as well as 90 more people, for the feast that lasted 3 days. That domestic philosopher, Irma Bombeck, commented that in contemporary America, Thanksgiving dinners take 18 hours to prepare. They are consumed in 12 minutes. Half times take 12 minutes. This is not coincidence. Clearly, they did not have football or big screen TV at the first Thanksgiving, though I'm not sure how Irma or any cook would feel about having another 90 mouths to feed. The Native Americans and English lived in a cooperative peace for about 10 years. They provided support and protection for each other against other more hostile native tribes. Unfortunately, the peaceful coexistence between the English and the Wampanoags ended with the arrival of an additional 25,000 Englishmen in the next few decades. Struggle over land eventually led to all-out war, and the native people were killed or pushed beyond their homeland. Many Native Americans gather to celebrate not a traditional Thanksgiving gathering, but a day of mourning. Another American philosopher, Jon Stewart, once of The Daily Show, commented that, "I celebrated Thanksgiving in an old-fashioned way. I invited everyone in my neighborhood to my house. We had an enormous feast. Then I killed them and took their land." Cedric Cromwell, not a very Native American-sounding name, is the Mashpee Wampanoag tribal chairman. He is a direct descendant of a participant in the first Thanksgiving and explains the dual celebration of giving thanks and mourning the terrible fate his people suffered at the hands of English settlers. In a Huffington Post article, Why Thanksgiving is a National Day of Mourning for Some Americans, Cromwell says, "We are Americans as well, and so even today, I sit down at Thanksgiving with my family. But it gives me an opportunity to speak to the kids and the family about the truth of the day, and why that day is important still to give thanks." He goes on, "Someone would say, why be so dark about it?" He says, well, it's real, it's truthful. It was a Holocaust, and that Holocaust must be shared and communicated so that we ensure that mankind doesn't do that to each other again. He says, we know this world is made up of travesty and tragedy. We also know that this world is made of a lot of goodness and hope and honesty and integrity. While the Pilgrims traditionally get credit for introducing the concept of Thanksgiving, the Wampanoags and other native tribes incorporated Thanksgiving into every day. Wampanoag, these names, the Wampanoag tribal elder Gladys Wittes explains, "Every day is a day of Thanksgiving to the Wampanoag. We give thanks to the dawn of the new day, at the end of the day, to the sun, to the moon," remember that phrase when we get to the benediction, "for rain, for helping crops to grow. There's always something to be thankful for." There's much to learn in the history of the first Thanksgiving, and it has nothing to do with high hats and buckle shoes. It has to do with honoring and remembering the resilience, the compassion, the welcoming spirit, which, though not rewarded in itself, still teaches us a lesson about what it is to be human and capable of great gratitude in the midst of great sorrow and hardship. I found the Puritan prayer that we will read at the end of the service today in a sermon by Dr. Patrick O'Neill. It's titled A Grateful Heart and delivered at the UU Fellowship in Paris in 2012. O'Neill said that he was struck by the frequency with which he encountered the phrase, "Spare us, O God, from a dead heart, while yet we live," as he studied the history of the first Puritan churches of the 1600s. Many of these churches evolved into Unitarian and Universalist parishes in the 1800s. He said he initially thought this was a particularly stark and disconsolate and joyless phrase. But as he studied the full prayer we will recite today, he realized the frequency or the fervency with which they dreaded a heart devoid of feeling, lacking a zest for life. He goes on to say that a thankful attitude, that is, thankfulness for life itself, not after the fact, but during the fact, in the midst of life. Thankfulness in the midst of the struggles, trials, tribulations, and disappointments that are part of every life. He says that's what the myth of Thanksgiving is really about. So today I thought about this sermon topic more than about Thanksgiving. It is a way of life of thanks living. The Wampanoags would go one step further. A Native American saying urges us, give thanks for unknown blessings already on their way. Not just what we have had, not only what we have now, but for all the blessings still to come. So in spite of all around us that can lead us to despair and leave us with a dead heart, we are still together here today. We have a lot to be thankful for. We have another 24 hours with 60 minutes in each hour and 60 seconds in each minute. That's 86,400 seconds today. Surely we can find the time and inclination to use at least one of them to say thanks.